In the grand halls of the Zotphorian Empire, where towering pillars of shimmering crystal reached toward artificial suns, Princess Cerilyn sat on her throne, watching another suitor kneel before her. The alien noble, a prince from a distant star system, spoke in a rehearsed, flowery tone, promising power, wealth, and loyalty. She barely heard him. She had heard it all before. Every suitor was the same, calculating, ambitious, and desperate to claim her hand for political gain. None of them saw her as a person. To them, she was a prize, a stepping stone to power. Cerilyn exhaled through her nose. "Leave," she said coldly. The prince blinked in shock. "But, Your Highness." "Leave," she repeated, voice sharp as a blade. The court fell silent. The rejected prince gritted his teeth and stormed out, his honor shattered. The gathered nobles murmured among themselves. Another one dismissed. Another suitor humiliated. Who could possibly win the heart of the untouchable princess? Meanwhile, across the palace in the royal guest chambers, Daniel Carter, a stranded human diplomat, paced back and forth. He wasn't supposed to be here. His ship had suffered a critical failure during a diplomatic mission, leaving him stranded on the Zyphorian homeworld. While waiting for repairs, the Emperor had invited him to stay as an observer at court. Daniel sighed. Politics weren't his thing. Back on Earth, he was just a junior diplomat, not some smooth-talking negotiator. A palace guard entered. "Human, the Emperor requests your presence at tonight's banquet." Daniel rubbed his temples. Great. More alien politics and awkward small talk. The banquet was a grand affair, held in a chamber with floating lanterns and music played by instruments that seemed to hum through the air itself. The Empire's most powerful nobles and warriors gathered, exchanging pleasantries and making deals over exotic foods. Daniel sat at the far end of the table, trying not to draw attention. But he felt eyes on him. The suitors, the nobles, even the princess herself, they were all watching him. And then, a noble suitor from a powerful house sneered at him. The blue-skinned warrior prince, draped in golden armor, leaned forward. "A human?" He scoffed, raising his glass. "I thought this gathering was for those of importance." The table chuckled at the insult. Daniel looked up. He had spent years navigating tense diplomatic situations, but this was just a bully trying to impress the crowd. With a smirk, he leaned back. "Funny. I was just thinking the same thing about you." Silence. The prince's face twisted in anger, while several nobles held back laughter. At the head of the table, Princess Cerilyn, for the first time that night, looked at Daniel with interest. The banquet hall fell silent. The noble suitor, still seething from Daniel's sharp reply, clenched his fists. No one had ever spoken to him like that. Daniel, on the other hand, remained calm. He had dealt with egotistical diplomats before, and this alien prince was no different. Loud, arrogant, and desperate for attention. Across the table, Princess Cerilyn watched with curiosity. She had expected the human to lower his head, to apologize, to act weak, just like most aliens did when challenged by nobility. But instead, he had pushed back. The blue-skinned prince slammed his goblet down. "Do you even know who I am, human?" Daniel tilted his head. "Someone who thinks he's important." A few of the nobles gasped, while others struggled to contain their laughter. The prince's face darkened. "You dare mock me?" Daniel sighed. "Look, if you're asking for respect, maybe don't insult an entire species before dinner. Just a tip." Cerilyn's lips curled into a small smile. This human was different. He spoke plainly, without the flowery words of suitors. He wasn't trying to impress anyone. He was just being himself. The Emperor, watching from the head of the table, finally spoke. "Enough." His voice was calm but commanding. The prince lowered his head, knowing better than to argue with the ruler of the Zotphorian Empire. The Emperor's gaze shifted to Daniel. "You have a sharp tongue, human. But can you back it up?" Daniel gave a small shrug. "Depends on what you mean." Cerilyn leaned forward, Do you fight? Daniel chuckled. Not with swords or fancy duels, if that's what you mean. The princess narrowed her eyes. Then how do humans defend themselves? Daniel smirked. By being smarter. A murmur spread across the hall. Some aliens looked unimpressed, others thoughtful. Cerilyn, however, found herself intrigued. Is that so? She said, tapping a finger against her goblet. Daniel nodded. Strength is useful, sure. But what's the point of power if you don't know how to use it? The Emperor chuckled, spoken like a true diplomat. The tension at the table faded, and conversation returned to normal. But Cerilyn wasn't done studying the human. She had spent years rejecting suitors, all of them warriors, generals, nobles, all of them predictable. Daniel was different. He had no status, no power, no royal blood. And yet, he had just stood his ground against one of the Empire's strongest suitors. For the first time in her life, Princess Cerilyn found herself curious about someone. And curiosity, for a princess like her, was dangerous. The days following the banquet were filled with strange tension, while the rest of the royal court continued with their usual politics and alliances. Princess Cerilyn found her thoughts drifting back to the human diplomat, Daniel Carter. She had seen him a few more times in the palace corridors, but each time he seemed so ordinary in comparison to the powerful beings that surrounded her. And yet, he made her think in ways she never had before. His bluntness, his wit, his confidence without arrogance was unlike anything she had ever encountered in any of her suitors. One afternoon, while she walked through the royal gardens, her thoughts were interrupted by a disturbance, a loud crash followed by shouting. Cerilyn's heart raced as she instinctively moved toward the noise. The sound led her to the training grounds, where several guards were struggling to contain a chaotic scene. A group of alien assassins, cloaked in dark robes, were attacking the palace, aiming to assassinate her. Cerilyn's eyes narrowed as she saw the dangerous blades the assassins wielded. But before she could give an order, something unexpected happened. Daniel, who had been walking nearby, charged into the fray, his eyes fixed on the attackers. He had no weapon, no armor, just his quick thinking and natural resourcefulness. Without hesitation, he grabbed a training sword lying nearby, swung it with surprising accuracy, and knocked one of the attackers off balance. The assassins, clearly caught off guard by the human's sudden intervention, faltered. But Cerilyn didn't hesitate either. She drew her blade and cut through the chaos, moving like a skilled dancer in the midst of battle. Together, Daniel and Cerilyn made an unlikely but effective team, managing to drive the attackers away. As the last assassin fell, Cerilyn stood tall, her chest rising and falling with the adrenaline of the fight. But when she turned to look for Daniel, she found him panting, holding the sword awkwardly, his face covered in sweat. "You're insane," she said with a slight grin. Daniel shrugged, wiping his forehead. "I wasn't just going to stand there." Cerilyn studied him for a long moment. "You're different, human." Daniel gave a tired smile. "I guess that's what they keep telling me." For a moment, their eyes locked. There was something in Cerilyn's gaze, something soft that hadn't been there before. She wasn't used to seeing people as equals. Her world was one of hierarchy, power, and respect earned through force. But with Daniel, it was different. He had no power. And yet, he had stood beside her without hesitation, equal in every way. Cerilyn's heart, usually so guarded, felt something stir. Was this what curiosity felt like? But she quickly dismissed the thought. Curiosity was dangerous. She had to focus on her duties. She had no time for distractions, and certainly no time for a human diplomat who didn't know his place. But as Daniel wiped his sword clean and smiled at her, Cerilyn found herself wondering just how long she could keep pretending he didn't matter. The court buzzed with gossip after the failed assassination attempt. Word quickly spread that Princess Cerilyn had not only survived the attack, but had been saved by a human diplomat, Daniel Carter, the one person who had been neither intimidated nor eager to flatter her. In the days that followed, the princess found herself drawn to Daniel more and more. She would occasionally catch his eye during court meetings, and each time she felt that familiar stirring inside her. Curiosity, confusion, and something else that she couldn't quite name. But not everyone in the palace was so pleased by Daniel's involvement in the attack. The noble houses of the empire, who had long been eyeing the princess for marriage, saw Daniel's actions as an outrage. He was a human, a lowly diplomat with no noble blood or rank, and yet he had stood beside their princess as if he were one of them. One afternoon, as the nobles gathered in the royal council hall, their whispers became louder. The blue-skinned prince, who had been humiliated by Daniel at the banquet, leaned toward another nobleman. "This is getting out of hand," the prince muttered, his eyes narrowing at Daniel, who sat across the room, speaking to the emperor. "The human has gained the princess's favor, and that is a danger to all of us." The nobleman nodded. "What are we going to do about it? We can't let a human walk in and disrupt the balance of power here." Their words didn't go unnoticed. Cerilyn, who had been quietly observing, overheard their conversation. For the first time, she realized just how much politics and power controlled everything in her life. She was expected to marry for the good of the empire, not for love or personal choice. Her marriage would secure alliances, not happiness. But she couldn't shake the feeling that Daniel was different. Meanwhile, Daniel had no idea of the brewing storm. To him, everything in the palace was strange and overwhelming. He had no intention of getting involved in royal politics, and certainly he hadn't planned on being the subject of so many rumors. One evening, after an exhausting day of diplomatic talks and discussions, Daniel wandered into the palace gardens to clear his mind. The cool breeze carried the scent of alien flowers he had never smelled before. The garden, so carefully maintained by the royal staff, was the one place where he could escape the constant pressure. As he walked, he didn't notice Cerilyn until she stepped out from behind a large marble column, blocking his path. "You're avoiding me, Daniel," she said, her tone quieter than usual. Daniel stopped and looked at her, surprised by the sudden confrontation. "I'm not avoiding you. Just trying to get some air." She studied him carefully, her eyes sharp. "I don't know what to make of you. You seem to think you can just walk into my world, disrupt everything, and then walk away as if it's nothing." He frowned. "I didn't ask for any of this. I just wanted to get through the next few days and get home." Cerilyn took a step closer. "But you stayed, and now you're tangled in something much bigger than yourself." Daniel met her gaze. "Maybe, but I'm not your enemy, Cerilyn. I'm just trying to survive, just like everyone else here." For a moment, they stood in silence, the tension between them almost tangible. The noise of the court seemed miles away. Cerilyn's voice softened. "It's not just about survival, Daniel. It's about power, family, duty." She looked away, her face troubled. "You wouldn't understand." Daniel took a step forward, his voice gentle. "Maybe not, but I understand what it feels like to be forced into something you don't want." Cerilyn's heart skipped a beat. For the first time, she felt vulnerable in front of him. But she quickly regained her composure. "You should be careful, human. The nobles here won't let you stay much longer if you keep causing trouble." Daniel nodded slowly. "I'll be careful, but I won't stop being myself." For a brief moment, Cerilyn didn't know what to say. She found herself wishing things were different, wishing that she didn't have to keep her walls up so high, but she couldn't change the rules of her world. Yet, deep inside, she knew something was shifting, and she didn't know how long she could keep pretending it didn't matter. As the days passed, Cerilyn found herself increasingly torn. The empire was a place where power ruled everything, and marriage was no exception. Every suitor had been a strategic choice, someone who could bring strength to her family's reign. But Daniel, he wasn't like the others. He had no noble title, no wealth, no power. Yet he had shown bravery, intelligence, and honesty in ways none of her suitors had. Saralyn tried to ignore the way her heart fluttered every time she saw him. Curiosity was one thing, but this was dangerous. She had her duty to the Empire, to her people, to her family. She couldn't let herself fall for someone who didn't belong in her world. But still, she couldn't stop thinking about him. One day, the Emperor, noticing the rising tension, decided to test Daniel's worth. He sent for Daniel to attend a special ceremony, a royal trial designed to measure the strength and resilience of those who sought to stand by the princess's side. Saralyn watched from the sidelines as Daniel was led into the arena, where a crowd of nobles gathered. The trial was legendary, a test of both mind and body. To win, a participant had to pass through a series of challenges, solving puzzles that tested wit and physical trials that measured endurance, agility, and strength. The first test was a series of puzzles designed to challenge the mind. Most participants solved them with the help of royal advisors, but Daniel, true to form, refused help. He moved quickly through each puzzle, his mind sharp and focused, solving one after another in record time. The crowd murmured in surprise. They hadn't expected this from a human. Next came the physical test. Participants were required to face a simulated battle, where they had to fight robotic opponents in a specially designed arena. These opponents were fierce and fast, resembling the Empire's strongest warriors. Most participants struggled, many failing to last more than a few minutes. Daniel stepped into the arena with nothing but his wits and a training blade. The moment the fight began, the robotic soldiers rushed at him. Saralyn watched, holding her breath. This was no longer just about the test. It was about proving his worth to her, to the entire court. Daniel was quick and strategic. He dodged their attacks, using their own momentum against them. While the robots were powerful, Daniel's human ingenuity gave him an edge. His moves were unpredictable, catching the robots off guard. It wasn't long before he had disabled several of them, leaving the others to retreat in defeat. The crowd erupted into applause. Even Saralyn couldn't help but be impressed. No one had expected him to be this good. The Emperor, his face unreadable, nodded in approval. Impressive. You have earned my respect, human. Saralyn felt a tightness in her chest. For the first time, she realized that Daniel wasn't just a human diplomat. He was someone who could stand beside her, as an equal. But there was more to this test than just proving his worth to the Emperor. The final part of the trial was the most personal. Saralyn herself. She stepped forward, holding a ceremonial sword, her eyes locking with Daniel's. The final test is simple, she said. Prove your worth to me, not with your skill, but with your heart. For a moment, the room fell silent. Daniel looked at her, understanding the weight of her words. It wasn't about strength or intelligence. It was about trust, respect, and a deeper connection. Daniel took a deep breath, his voice steady. I've already shown you what I can do. But I don't need to prove anything to you. I'm here because I believe in you. Saralyn. Her heart skipped a beat. Was this the answer she had been waiting for? Saralyn held his gaze, unsure of what came next. But one thing was certain. Daniel had won her respect, and for the first time in a long time, he had made her believe in something other than duty. The days after the trial felt strange to Saralyn. Despite her best efforts to focus on her duties and keep her emotions in check, her thoughts kept returning to Daniel. He had proven himself not only in the arena, but also with his honesty and unwavering confidence. He had stood by her side, not out of ambition or greed, but because he truly believed in her. And for the first time in her life, Saralyn found herself feeling something she couldn't control. She had been trained to believe that her role as princess came with a responsibility. Her marriage had to be a political move, something that would strengthen the empire and ensure peace among the noble houses. It was never about love. But Daniel, he was different. She couldn't stop thinking about him. As the days passed, Saralyn became more and more distracted. Her duties at court were slipping. During important meetings, her mind would wander, her attention drawn to the human diplomat, who now occupied a strange, unwanted place in her heart. One evening, as she walked the palace halls, she bumped into him in one of the corridors. "Princess," Daniel said with a small smile, looking slightly surprised but not uncomfortable. "I didn't expect to see you here." Cerilyn looked at him for a moment, then took a deep breath, feeling the weight of her own emotions. "I didn't expect to see you either, Daniel," she said softly. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was charged, as if the air itself had thickened with unspoken words. Finally, Cerilyn spoke again, her voice low. "I don't know what to do." Daniel's brow furrowed in confusion. "What do you mean?" She looked away, gathering her thoughts. "I've spent my whole life following the rules of the Empire, doing what's expected of me. Marriage, alliances, power, all for the good of my people." Daniel's expression softened. "And now you feel like you're stuck." Cerilyn nodded. "I never had a choice before, but now I feel like I have one. And it scares me." Daniel stepped closer, his tone gentle. "You're not stuck, Cerilyn. You're just choosing a different path. It's okay to not follow the rules." Her heart skipped a beat. Was he really saying what she thought he was? "I'm not like the suitors you've had," Daniel continued, his voice steady. "I'm just human. But I know what I feel. And I think you feel it too." Cerilyn swallowed hard, feeling a mixture of emotions flood over her. Fear, excitement, doubt. She had never allowed herself to feel anything for anyone. She couldn't. Her duty had always been clear. But now, Daniel was here, standing in front of her, his eyes full of honesty, and Cerilyn realized that the walls she had built around her heart were beginning to crumble. "I don't know what this means," Cerilyn whispered, her voice almost lost in the quiet of the corridor. "But I can't ignore it anymore." Daniel's eyes softened with understanding. "You don't have to decide right now. Take your time. But remember, whatever you choose, I'll be here." Cerilyn nodded, a mix of relief and confusion washing over her. She was at a crossroads, a place where duty and desire clashed. She had always lived for her people, for her family, for the Empire. But now, she was faced with the choice of following her heart or continuing on the path that had been set for her long ago. The decision would not be easy. But for the first time, Cerilyn realized that her heart might not be as empty as she had always thought. The days that followed were heavy with tension. Cerilyn's heart was torn, struggling between her duty and her growing feelings for Daniel. She couldn't keep pretending that the bond between them wasn't real. But every time she let herself think about what she wanted, the weight of responsibility would press down on her. Meanwhile, the court had become a battlefield in its own right. Whispers of the human diplomat's growing influence were spreading like wildfire, and the noble houses were furious. They had always considered Cerilyn their prize, and now it seemed as though she was becoming too attached to someone they deemed beneath her. One evening, as Cerilyn walked through the palace gardens, trying to clear her mind, she was approached by one of her trusted advisors. He looked nervous, his eyes darting around the garden before settling on her. "Princess," he whispered urgently, "we have a problem." Cerilyn's heart skipped a beat. "What's happened?" "The nobles. They've had enough. They've planned to eliminate Daniel," the advisor said, his voice trembling. "They've already set their plan in motion. It won't be long before they act." Cerilyn's blood ran cold. "What do you mean, eliminate? Are they planning to kill him?" The advisor nodded grimly. "Yes. They'll make it look like an accident, an unfortunate turn of events during the festivities. He won't survive it, Your Highness." Cerilyn's mind raced. She had to act quickly, but she couldn't just charge into the court and expose the conspiracy. It would make everything worse. Her emotions were clouding her judgment, and yet she knew she couldn't let them hurt Daniel. Hours later, Cerilyn found Daniel in one of the quieter corridors of the palace. He was standing by a large window, gazing out at the night sky. When he saw her, he smiled, though there was a hint of concern in his eyes. "You look troubled," Daniel said, his voice soft. "I have a reason to be." Saralyn replied, her voice shaking slightly. "You're in danger. The nobles, they've planned to kill you." Daniel's face hardened, his hand tightening into a fist. "So, it's true. They want me gone." Saralyn nodded. "I can't let this happen. But I can't protect you alone. We need a plan, and we need to move quickly." Daniel took a step closer to her. "Then we'll face this together. I don't need to hide, Saralyn. If they want to try, then let them. But I won't run from this." Her heart swelled with a mix of admiration and fear. He wasn't afraid. He was willing to stand by her, even knowing the consequences. But Saralyn knew that they couldn't face the entire court without a strategy. She had to find a way to outsmart the nobles, to make them realize that Daniel was not their enemy, and that perhaps they had underestimated him. Later that night, as the court gathered for a grand feast, Saralyn and Daniel made their move. They knew the nobles would act soon, but Saralyn had a plan. She had arranged for a few trusted guards to guard the hallways, ready to stop any attempts to harm Daniel. However, as they approached the feast, the unexpected happened. The nobles had already put their plan into motion. Before Saralyn could react, Daniel was ambushed by several masked figures who moved quickly, grabbing him and pulling him into the shadows. "No," Saralyn cried, her voice filled with panic. But she didn't hesitate. She drew her sword and charged forward, determined to protect the one person who had never seen her as just a princess, but as a person. The fight was chaotic, but Saralyn fought with a fierce determination. Her heart pounded, and adrenaline surged through her as she fought beside Daniel, slashing at the masked attackers. Together, they made a powerful team. He with his quick thinking, and she with her fierce skill. After a brutal struggle, they managed to defeat their attackers. But the victory came at a cost. Daniel was injured, a deep cut on his arm from one of the attackers. Saralyn quickly knelt beside him, her hands shaking as she tried to stop the bleeding. "You're going to be okay, Daniel." Her voice trembled with emotion. But in her heart, she knew this was only the beginning. They had won this battle, but the war for their future had only just begun. And Saralyn realized that she could no longer hide from her feelings. Daniel had become more than just a diplomat. He was now her partner, her equal. The choice she had avoided for so long was now staring her in the face. She had to choose between the empire she had always known and the future she could have with him. But she was no longer afraid. The chaos in the palace subsided as the last of the masked attackers were taken away by the guards. Daniel was still injured, his arm wrapped in a hastily made bandage, but his eyes were full of determination. He hadn't backed down, not for a moment. And now, Saralyn could see him for what he truly was, not just a human diplomat, but a warrior in his own right. As the tension settled, Saralyn helped Daniel to his feet, guiding him toward a quiet chamber away from the prying eyes of the court. The nobles, who had once seen Daniel as nothing more than a lowly human, were now watching from afar, their thoughts undoubtedly changing. Saralyn couldn't help but think about the confrontation they had just survived. The nobles had underestimated Daniel's strength, just as they had underestimated her. She realized that for too long, she had allowed others to dictate her life, her choices, her future. Now, standing beside Daniel, she knew what she had to do. The emperor, having learned of the assassination attempt and the bravery shown by Daniel, called for a royal meeting. The entire court was summoned to the grand hall, where the nobles gathered in their finest robes and armor. Saralyn stood beside the emperor, her heart pounding in her chest. The moment of truth had arrived. When the doors of the hall opened, Saralyn walked in with confidence. The room grew quiet as the nobles turned to look at her. For the first time, she felt no fear, no pressure to conform to their expectations. She was ready to make her own decision. Standing tall, she spoke. "The time has come for me to declare my intentions." The room was still. The emperor looked at her, his face unreadable. Saralyn turned to Daniel, who stood beside her, his expression steady. In that moment, she knew her heart would never lie to her again. "This is Daniel Carter," Cerilyn said, her voice strong and unwavering. "Not just a human diplomat, but a man who has proven his worth to me and to this empire." The nobles murmured, some confused, others in rage. They had expected her to choose an alliance through marriage, an alliance with one of their powerful families. But Cerilyn had made her choice. She looked directly at the emperor. "I have made my decision. Daniel will not be cast aside. He is the one I choose." The emperor studied her carefully, his eyes narrowing slightly. There was no hint of anger in his gaze, only curiosity. He had always been a ruler who believed in the strength of his bloodline, but now he was faced with something new and unexpected. He nodded slowly. "You have made your choice, Cerilyn, and it is not one I will fight." His voice was firm, but there was a hint of respect in it that Cerilyn hadn't expected. "If you believe this human is worthy, then I will not stand in your way." The room fell silent as the nobles digested his words. Some were angry, others shocked, but none dared to challenge the emperor's decision. Cerilyn felt a weight lift off her shoulders. The court could not dictate her future. She had chosen it for herself. And now, for the first time in her life, she felt free. Turning to Daniel, she reached out, her hand finding his. "Together, we will shape the future of this empire." Daniel's grip tightened on her hand, and for a moment, everything felt right. In that moment, they weren't just an alien princess and a human diplomat. They were partners. And together, they would face whatever the future held. The court had expected the princess to follow tradition, to marry someone of noble blood and power. But Cerilyn had chosen a different path, a path of her own making. And with Daniel by her side, she was ready to face whatever came next. Her heart was no longer bound by duty. It was free, just like her future. And for the first time, Cerilyn felt truly alive. The decision had been made. The court had accepted Cerilyn's choice, though many of the nobles still grumbled under their breath. The empire was used to power struggles, to politics that shaped marriages into alliances. But Cerilyn's choice to marry Daniel, a human with no title or wealth, had shaken the very foundations of their world. Cerilyn stood by Daniel's side in the royal gardens one evening, her heart a mix of emotions. They had both risked everything, and now their future depended on how the rest of the empire would accept this union. Would they continue to fight against the inevitable change, or would they finally see the truth? But before Cerilyn could voice her worries, a sudden noise broke through the quiet. Guards rushed into the gardens, their faces tight with panic. The lead guard spoke quickly, urgency in his voice. "Princess, there is a rebellion led by the disgruntled nobles. They plan to overthrow the emperor and seize control." Cerilyn's heart sank. The nobles had never accepted Daniel, and now they had gone too far. This wasn't just about power anymore. It was personal. "Where is the emperor?" Cerilyn demanded, her voice steady despite the panic rising inside her. "In the palace courtyard, Your Highness, but they're already surrounding the gates. There's no time to wait for reinforcements." Cerilyn's jaw tightened. She turned to Daniel, who was already moving toward her side. "We can't let them win," she said, her voice fierce. Daniel nodded, his hand finding hers. "We won't. We'll face them together." They ran through the halls, preparing for the battle ahead. The palace was in chaos, soldiers clashing in the halls, but Cerilyn and Daniel moved with a purpose. Together, they could change the course of the empire's future. In the courtyard, the emperor was surrounded by his loyal guards, but the rebels were closing in. The leader of the rebellion, the once powerful noble who had tried to use Daniel's status against him, stepped forward, his voice carrying across the courtyard. "You're making a mistake, Cerilyn. This human will never be your equal. He is a symbol of everything wrong with your reign. Give him up, and we'll spare you both." Cerilyn stepped forward, her heart burning with determination. She could feel Daniel at her back, his presence steady and unwavering. "I don't care what you think," she said, her voice loud and clear. "This is my choice. Daniel is not my weakness. He is my strength. The rebel leader sneered, his hand raised as if ready to strike. But before he could move, Cerilyn drew her sword, the sound of metal ringing out in the tense silence. No one will harm him. Not today. The fight that followed was fast and brutal. Cerilyn fought with a fury she had never known, her every move fueled by the need to protect Daniel and the future they had chosen together. Daniel, though unarmed at first, used his surroundings, his quick thinking and resourcefulness, to turn the tide in their favor. Together, they broke through the rebels' line, reaching the leader who had threatened to destroy everything they had built. The moment he saw Cerilyn's resolve, he knew he was defeated. With a final cry of defiance, the rebel leader fell. The battle was over. The palace was in ruins, but Cerilyn and Daniel stood victorious. The rebellion had been crushed, and the Empire's future, once uncertain, was now in their hands. The Emperor, standing at the edge of the courtyard, watched the two of them. His face was unreadable, but there was something else in his eyes now. Respect. Cerilyn, you have shown true strength. And so has he. The Emperor's voice was softer now, almost a whisper. I see now that what you have chosen is not just a marriage. It is the future of this empire. Cerilyn turned to Daniel, her heart full of relief. They had made it. They had fought for each other, for their love, and for the future they would build together. She took his hand, knowing that this was just the beginning. Together, they had proven that no matter the odds, love and determination could reshape even the greatest of empires. The future was theirs. The sun rose over the Xiphorian Empire, casting a soft glow on the palace that had seen so much turmoil. The battle was over, the rebels defeated, and the empire was beginning to heal. But for Cerilyn, nothing felt as certain as the person standing beside her, Daniel. Together, they had faced the greatest challenge of their lives, and against all odds, they had emerged victorious. The court had changed. The nobles who had once whispered behind her back now held their tongues, some even nodding in reluctant respect. They could see it now, the strength in Cerilyn's choice, the one that had defied tradition and turned the course of history. The human who had once been seen as beneath them was now not just a diplomat, but a symbol of change, of a new future for the empire. Cerilyn and Daniel stood at the balcony of the palace, overlooking the great city below. The sounds of the bustling streets reached their ears, but there was a calm in the air now, a peace that hadn't been there before. You know, Daniel said, breaking the silence, I never imagined my life would bring me here. I never thought I'd be standing by your side like this. Cerilyn glanced at him, her eyes soft but filled with something fierce. I didn't think I'd ever let anyone close, but here we are. Daniel smiled. I guess we're both full of surprises. There was no more need for grand speeches. Their journey had already spoken volumes. Cerilyn had defied the rules of her world, and Daniel had proven that humans had something to offer, something the Empire had never understood. They were a perfect balance, their strengths complementing each other in ways no one could have predicted. But it wasn't just their victory that mattered, it was what came next. Cerilyn had chosen her future. She had chosen Daniel, not because of any political reason, but because he had shown her a different kind of strength, one that was not built on bloodlines or power, but on respect, honesty, and love. Do you think they'll ever accept it? Cerilyn asked quietly, her gaze fixed on the horizon. I think they already have, Daniel replied, his hand finding hers. Not all at once, maybe, but they will. People always adjust. Cerilyn felt a lightness she hadn't known in years. She had chosen to follow her heart, to step away from tradition, and create a new path for herself. She had once believed that the weight of duty would always come first, but now, with Daniel beside her, she saw the truth. Duty didn't mean sacrificing happiness. I never wanted to be trapped by my title, Cerilyn said softly. I wanted to be free, to choose for myself. And now you have, Daniel said, his voice steady with reassurance. And we'll make it work, together. The palace was quiet, and for the first time, Saralyn could see the future clearly. It wasn't about following in the footsteps of her ancestors. It was about building something new. With Daniel, she knew she could face whatever came next. The empire was hers to lead, but it wasn't the crown that made her strong. It was the love she had found in a human, the one who had never treated her like a princess, but as a person. As they stood together on the balcony, Saralyn and Daniel knew their journey was just beginning. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but they would face it side by side, unshaken by the weight of tradition or the disapproval of others. And for the first time in her life, Saralyn realized she wasn't just the princess of the Sci-Fi Empire. She was a woman in love, with a future of her own choosing. Together, they would write their own story.